that discovery of oil also has sort of this mythology woven around it, which includes both these aspects of kind of like divine benediction, like oil from the rock. The biblical quote was just
Right.
all over, all over the oil industry promotions of this new oil region, and also includes some some misinterpretations and misuses of Indigenous history.
Right, so they basically I was super unaware of how prevalent it was for the early oil industry to work backwards from certain uh spiritual claims. You mentioned an example there, but do you mind expanding a little bit on some of the others?
Yeah. So, and a lot of this comes from Darren Dochuk's great book, Anointed with Oil, which kind of like very extensively documents this kind of spiritualization of oil as a resource, which includes, um, and kind of in the early days of oil, in the 1850s, when there's not any kind of scientific way of predicting its location. Uh, it really is a matter of kind of intuition, and there are a lot of people are making different assertions about their powers to commune with the unseen world of oil. And so you have like a lot of different approaches, all of which, claim this kind of like special communion, uh, and are plugged into this kind of overarching teleology, again, of manifest destiny, of like, this is something that has been, this is a resource that has been laid in store for millennia until the right people were there to utilize it in the right way. Again, associating this very sort of classic 19th century progressive narrative, associating white US civilization with the culmination of the purpose of the land.
And with this explosion of this resource that has been the bloodiest resource and um commodity that has driven so much of the worst parts of capitalism over the past uh plus 100 years plus and more 200 years. And so it really is a stark contrast for it to be portrayed as this I discovering it as this natural phenomenon of beauty and mysticism versus the reality that we deal with in 2022 of it ha- completely being this dark force that's polluting our planet and r- the extraction of it ravaging lands and by extension of course indigenous people that live on those lands. And that was but all that was true at its outset. It's just that it was new and novel, so there's a way to assign it some sort of mysticism, that to not to overuse that word.
Yeah, well, and that was one of my like research questions. I was like, is this cursed? Like, how
Yeah.
cursed is this? And of course, like that's a historical thing and a relative thing. And so, I'm looking at these people who are literally communing with spirits, what they consider to be heavenly spirits who are guiding them to oil. And part of that spiritualist mythos is also the belief that what they called Indian spirits, which were an important part of spiritualist cosmology, um, which is to say the indigenous dead in the afterlife, who they gave this particular role of being spirit guides. Um, they believed that these Indian spirits were especially, helpful in leading them to oil, again, fulfilling this destiny. Um, but yeah, I looked at practices like that and was kind of like, that seems maybe like not so much heavenly spirits as something else that they've
It it's
communed
their
with.
nickname for their own greed, I guess, right?
I mean, you can read it as a manifestation of these other other forces. And it was also important to look at, in each of the sites in the book, I'm also interested in just doing a deep history of that specific place and the forces that have shaped it. And so, looking prior to the discovery of oil in Western Pennsylvania and Western New York, the indigenous history of that region is that, they were also using oil in their own way. It was often used medicinally, and it had spiritual importance. And so, and was an item of trade. So it was like, it got around. And so understanding that is also a way of understanding that like resources are utilized in certain ways by certain societies, and that it's not inherent in oil itself that it even is this destructive thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another resource that was utilized in a destructive way by colonists that you talk about, but is utilized differently by indigenous people in North America, for example, are our waterways. And so, at the same time as oil is exploding, right, you have this mass building of hydroelectric power and dams and things like that. What did you find in some of your research about how that affected uh, Native indigenous communities and also some of the ways that the capitalists doing that would justify it using kind of like those same tropes.
Yeah. So what got me interested in dams was actually an example in Maryland, where uh, there's an area on the Susquehanna River that had like large petroglyphs sort of inscribed on the rocks around the narrow part of the river. And of course, the Narrows is where it was most effective to build a dam. And so, as the dam was being constructed, sort of the local scientific society in Maryland was trying to get the petroglyphs preserved in their view by actually removing them from the river. And so that kind of, and they ultimately like removed them with dynamite, and then kind of like tried to piece them back together with cement.
Jeez.
Um, and so that like combination of erasing, claiming, and then they start to tell stories again about how the petroglyphs might have been created by a lost non-Indian race. And so that move of taking them and sort of re-signifying them, all triggered by this dam being constructed in order to harness the river's power, um, evoked for me this larger history of dam building, which is, Nick Estes writes about it in his book, Our History is the Future, just that across the West, dams flooded the most important, the most vital indigenous lands. And that this, again, was a practice, a sort of non-military way of taking indigenous land.
And when you say non-military way, it's also it's helpful to see those things in tandem, right? As capitalism being an extension of power in very similar ways and in tandem with military power and conquering and all of the ways that we the more surface level ways that we perceive we see how uh westward expansion went.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a really central message of the book is just that the way that capitalism and its need for continuous growth has become equated with spiritual necessity, and life itself. That, without, and so we see this in the sort of congressional discussion of the need for dam building in the West. Senators and congressmen are out there arguing that if we don't do this, if we don't build these dams and make this semi-arid land arable for industrial scale agriculture, this will represent like the decline of our civilization. And so they very openly like speak in these sort of apocalyptic tones that if we don't do this, if we don't exploit every possible resource, that will be it for us.
It is unbelievable too, because um that time just seems so characterized by this drive uh for forward. I mean, it's really, I'm about to go the long way to talk about manifest destiny and how that is just a through line, and it shows itself in different ways. Um, and in terms of the dams that were built throughout the US and destroying a lot of native sites and lands, um, what were in your research, what were some other egregious examples that you can think of, particularly because, when it comes to dam building and during that time period, because then I do wanna move, into the 20th century, where we can go to the southwestern US, but I didn't wanna move off of this too quickly.
Yeah. Well, and so a lot of that dam building is early 20th century actually, and um, so we think about sort of the Depression era dam building as it's often sort of in the History Channel version. It's inspirational, because this sort of lifted the U.S. out of the Depression, and it fueled U.S. power during World War II. And so I think like it's not to like discredit the possibility of public works, which I think are very important and are like a very important element of a Green New Deal and any kind of future where we don't all die. So it's not to discredit the possibility of that, but yeah, to like look very carefully at who is asked to bear the disproportionate burden. And I mean, specifically in this case, like Indigenous nations are being denied sovereignty with these moves. And so, I mean, almost all of these major dams, I mean, I can't think of one that didn't. I mean, so like the Columbia Dam is an example of something that was, essentially pushed people off their land